Okay, I think we're recording. I think we're in good shape. You should be able to. Everything looks good. Carry on.
Okay. Most of you probably know me from working with me on Nova and OpenStack clients and SDK and whatever other projects. I've been putting a lot of effort over the last couple of years, along with Artem GTEMA, on the OpenStack SDK and the OpenStack client efforts, trying to kind of flesh those out to get them covering all the gaps in Cinder and all the other projects. One of the things that Artem has been looking at in recent months has been this idea of auto-generating clients. He's been working on auto-generating a Rust client that doesn't at the moment obviously live within the OpenStack ecosystem because of the different language and that, but his initial tests for that have been very positive in terms of performance. He's posted about that on the mailing list a few times. He had a proposal he wanted basically some kind of a common schema that he could generate all these clients from. And his initial proposal was to store all of this stuff out of tree. That is undesirable because it reverts us back to it keeps us basically siloed, working on something that isn't necessarily a true reflection of the actual APIs. It makes us basically have to do manual syncing of schemas from the actual code versus what the schema says the code is doing. Things like that. We don't want to do that. So I've been looking into techniques to avoid doing that. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the vast majority of the core OpenStack services use JSON schema for request body and query string parameter validation in a lot of cases, including Cinder. OpenAPI 3.1 is a superset of JSON schema. My proposal here is that we look at the existing request schemas that we have, make sure they're complete. Having had a quick skim through them, they are pretty complete. There's a few things missing around the various actions that Cinder supports, but it's pretty comprehensive. Flesh out all of those and then add schemas for all of the responses, the response bodies. So those will look exactly like the schemas that we have for the request bodies at the moment, only obviously they'll apply to the response bodies. There'll be a config option that will allow you to turn on the validation of response bodies using those schemas. That will be disabled by default. We won't tell people to turn it on. In fact, we'll tell them don't turn this on in production because it doesn't do, you don't want it on. Obviously, the validation happens after the server has done what it needs to do. So users will be seeing, by turning this on, they'll start getting HTTP 500 errors, even though the actual side effects has happened, which we don't want. But we will be turning it on. I'm proposing turning it on by default within our unit tests and within CI environments. The idea being that at some point, CI environments down the line, unit test first. The idea being that any 500 errors we see is a failure of our schemas and therefore a discrepancy in our documentation versus our real world API implementation. So yeah, add a whole load of response body schemas, add a few missing request body and query string parameter schemas, the config option, and then there'll be tooling either maintained in tree in Cinder that'll spit out an OpenAPI schema, or in a separate project. Artem has spun up an initial effort at that will effectively go and introspect the API router, the routes router, and just pull all of this metadata from that. Yeah, that's the basic proposal. I've gone through it in a little more detail in the spec. In terms of the advantage of doing this work, we can start using this both in the likes of OpenAPI, but also down the line if we want to do a Rust SDK and later a Rust shell client. I've been doing a lot of work on Gopher Cloud lately because most of my time is now spent on OpenShift and Kubernetes. Gopher Cloud has the exact same issue that OpenStack SDK does with regards to the amount of people that are working on it and the amount of APIs we need to support. So it'll also benefit us there. There's Cinder API docs. There are 1 or 2 gaps. I've proposed patches in the past to fulfill them. Most of them tend to be around like an odd missing parameter, or like a deprecated API that isn't documented. So they're not that big, but there are still some gaps. I know the last cycle or two, this might have changed in the last cycle or two, because I recall someone saying that there were students that were going to be working on validation, but I don't know if that happened. But yeah, we get that for free, and it'll probably highlight a whole load of, well, hopefully not, but it might highlight some bugs and kind of issues in our API that become obvious once you actually try and document them in a programmatic manner, and you're like, you see how this is done is maybe suboptimal and could be improved in a micro version. The downside of this is JSON schema is hellish enough to write, and it can be hard enough to review because it's a big blob of JSON, or in our case, a big dictionary. I don't think that's going to be that big an issue, because Artem thankfully has done a lot of work already to produce these schemas. So I've been working on Nova and to a lesser degree Cinder to see what it would look like doing this. I've been mostly able to copy and paste, convert them from JSON into valid Python code, and they've mostly just worked. And we also have a lot of unit tests around our API coverage. So by turning on this validation by default, our unit tests will test the schemas for us. And so long as the unit tests aren't doing something that the API shouldn't allow, which they shouldn't because the unit tests are passing, we'll make sure that our schemas, if anything, the schemas will be a little too loose and might need a bit of tightening up, but they shouldn't be so strict as to suggest that clients should be doing something that something unnecessarily complicated. I have a whole load of open questions. These are all predicated on the idea the general idea being accepted, but I wanted to see if this idea made sense to the Cinder community, if this was something that I would be able to get reviews for if I was to push up patches to do this, if anyone had any serious concerns, the usual things. So fire away.
So regarding the API reference, we do have that API sample generation by test. We have that feature in place, and I think Nova also does. And it has some test that generates the whole JSON. So that was the main purpose, that sometimes there are syntax error when we write it manually, and it auto generates it. So I think this is also, a part of this also trying to address that issue.
So the API sample test, adding this to Nova has been very useful. The presence of those in Nova has been really useful because they've highlighted bugs in the schemas as that we've been adding them that weren't necessarily highlighted in unit tests. So that's actually good to hear that I wasn't aware they were there in Cinder. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, we had interns. So initial efforts, I think I started that effort way back, but we had last year interns that were working on. Desire was here some time ago. I'm not sure if she is here, but yeah, 2 of the interns did add more schema validation to that. Maybe I will read the spec, but I'm not able to understand the whole effort, because even on the schemas part, we do have some schema validation in place in Cinder. So are we trying to unify it in a way like all these use cases can be handled with one thing?
Yeah, so the gaps that are there at the moment, the schemas that are there mostly focus on the requests. They all focus on the requests. They don't do anything to do with responses. So that's the first thing. The request schemas that are actually there, you can set a description field on pretty much any one of the parameters. For example, in an object, you can set a description for the object itself. That information isn't there, which makes sense because these are only used for validation. They're not currently used for documentation. And there's no, we'll say, automated correlation between a schema and the actual endpoint. So we know where the schemas are, and I can manually correlate a schema with an endpoint. But like, this is trivial enough to resolve, but there's no way of saying, okay, this is my API, this is the path, this is the schema for this path, which is what we want from generating an open API schema perspective. That's with the request schemas. From the response side of things, there's no schemas for any of our response bodies at the moment. We
so
have,
Steve,
yeah.
So sorry. So for the request, you mean you need something in the schema itself indicating what the path the schema is used for?
No, literally all we need to do is the decorator, that validation decorator that we use to mark up a function, that needs to set an attribute. Like, it's really easy to do. We just need to set an attribute as part of that decorator on the function that the introspection tool can basically use to pull it out of the router.
Okay.
So it can build a path, and then it can look through the attributes of each function that the path correlates to and just pull the schema from it. That part's really easy, but it doesn't exist at the moment, so we need a patch to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that needs to be done. The other thing that needs to be done is we're doing some things that don't happen. So from a Cinder perspective, we're doing some things in Cinder that don't exist in Nova. So Nova tends to have a single method for each individual action, and it tends to have if, for example, you have an action that's not under like /action, if you have like /reboot, which is, and you have to like post to that, and it's effectively like an RPC style API, /resume and /suspend will have separate methods within the controller. We don't do that in Cinder in some cases. We have like update, and then we check the ID, and if the ID equals resume, then that's the resume action. If the ID equals suspend, then we're attempting to suspend. And if the ID equals anything else, we're attempting an update action on an existing resource. Some of those things need to be rejigged just so we can do the automatic, again, correlation of a particular path to a particular schema. And then once we have all those schemas in place, focusing on the request stuff, we can basically have a little tool that loops through all of the methods associated with our router, pulls out the paths, pulls out the schemas, dumps them into an open API documentation that we can publish as part of our docs. And then anyone in the world can go and run a client generation tool that will spit out a JavaScript client for Cinder, or a Rust-based client for Cinder, or whatever else. It's completely automated, and it means that we don't need myself and Artem and a whole load of interns writing all of these patches for OpenStack SDK, such as the theory.
So regarding this response validation, so I did mention the samples, but also in the Tempest side, there has been some work done that does validate all the responses for different projects. I don't have idea like how that could be related to the effort, but yeah, we do have some validation there existing.
Yeah, so this is kind of doing the validation within tests is kind of a side effect. The main reason that I'd want to do that is to make it useful to have all these dictionaries within the Cinder source code outside of just documentation and generating a schema that other people can use. And B, to make sure that things are actually valid. Like, we can go and write a whole load of open API docs, but we've had this situation before where our documentation was produced by a different team from the people working on the actual source code. And as any of you that were around when we dragged all that stuff in tree will know, there was an awful lot of stuff said in the documentation that wasn't actually true, or was, didn't quite reflect reality. We don't want to do that. We also don't want just myself and Artem maintaining tens of thousands of lines of open API specs. We want to be able to pull them directly from the Cinder source code effectively. So the idea of doing validation within Cinder itself is a test only thing. You kind of have it like you might not even need it because Tempest is doing that already, maybe, or you're already doing it through the API sample test. But it is another layer of kind of validation. And importantly, it's a way of making sure that those schemas stay in sync with the like what the code is actually doing and doesn't get out of sync. And then what it would look like from a contributor perspective is if they do a micro version that adds a new field to a response, as they add the new field, they need to add that to the JSON, like they need to add a new JSON schema version, like, you know, volumes underscore v2 something, that adds that new field into the schema. And if they don't, the test will start failing. And if they do, the open API spec will be regenerated the next time you build your docs, and whoever's auto generating clients and stuff, they'll run their generation code again, and boom, the clients are automatically updated. In theory, a one-step process. So there should be minimal impact once it's added. And I think there should also be minimal impact from a review perspective, because as I said, we have the validate, we're running API sample tests, we're running unit tests. If the schemas are lying, the tests will start failing and we have to go and fix the schemas before we're even able to merge them. So you should be able to just roughly skim down through things. Does all of this look roughly correct? Do I see anything immediately wrong? If not, boom, merge it away. We get an open API spec out of it at the end. Such is the hope. Any other questions on it? What I should have done, I have a whole load of work in progress patches here, but I was reluctant to push anything up until in case I needed to massively change direction and stuff. I can push those up as part of, like, before the spec is approved, just so people can see where it's actually going. So Nova's a little more complete. I have about half of the Nova response body validation stuff added, including a few tricky ones like server rebuild. But if you've ever added request body schemas, it looks exactly the same. It's a Python dictionary with specific keys, you know, the type, the properties if it's an object, or like the enum if it's a string, stuff like that. There's a couple of decorators needed. So in theory, every HTTP, everything that returns like a 200 code and therefore has a body should be now decorated with at least one schema, depending on how many microversions there are. So there'll be maybe 100 extra lines of code where we add all those decorators, and then probably a couple of thousand lines of JSON schema, mostly self-validating. And there should be no API. There's no API microversion impact because this doesn't affect us at runtime. Like I said, this isn't something that you should turn on in production. There's no advantage to doing so. But people are able to, at the end, get their lovely open API spec and go and auto generate all their clients, and later on all their documentation from it. So it seems like a no-brainer to me, but
Did you want to take us through your open questions?
Sure. Yep. So I have kind of answers in mind for all of these, but I'll go through them anyway. So the first one is, do we want to add schemas for any deprecated APIs that, you know, have been removed in a previous micro version, but aren't actually, the code is still there if you request the old micro version? I don't know, do you have any APIs in Cinder that return, like, have been just completely got rid of, like Nova Network that just returns 410s because the code behind it has gone?
I don't think so. I think
groups. You don't use consistency group APIs as of now, right? Like We prefer volume group.
But we don't.
But we didn't remove it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't remove it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, the next one is kind of, that point is actually a moot point in this question. But yeah, my question here is like, do we spend time validating the, where's the strike through? There we go. Do we spend time adding schemas for the deprecated APIs? I'm thinking we have to, because if we want to generate documentation and you want your documentation to include those deprecated APIs, then you need the schemas to generate the documentation from. That only
So I was
applies
thinking-
if we care about documentation.
I was thinking the exact opposite, that we don't want to encourage people to use them. So we don't want the open API stuff generated for the, so like the consistency groups that Rajat was talking about. We want people to just use groups.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking if we don't do those, then, right, it'll be basically like they don't exist as far as
The tooling goes.
yeah.
Do you, in the API ref, the Cinder API ref, do you still have documentation for consistency groups?
Yeah,
And
and it
that's-
says they're deprecated and don't use them, and that they'll eventually be replaced. So, but we just haven't, because it's
Okay, so my this, one of the suggestions here is that OS API ref tool can eventually be replaced with something that generates directly from the open API schema, which you can keep in tree. If we were to do that, naturally we would either, if we weren't to deprecate API, document deprecated APIs, we'd lose, those things would disappear when we'd switch the tools across. So that would be one thing to think about if you were okay with losing the documentation for those things. I mean, you can just tell them to look at, check out pre-Dalmation Cinder and build the API ref docs locally if they want to. Doesn't bother me, it's less work for me, but I just want to make sure that you're okay with, if we went down this road and we switched our tools across, you'd be okay with losing those documents or documentation for those APIs.
I think so, because the idea was that they were going to go away, and it's just we haven't put there's been other stuff to do, and we haven't put the effort into cutting people off. So this would kind of be a forcing point. So we'd either have to finally get rid of them, or go ahead and do the implementation then if we want to keep them. So that'll be our problem, not yours.
Ideal. Yeah, so the way that I've done this, I'm tackling this in Nova, is I have a deprecated decorator, and it literally sets like underscore deprecated on the function, and then I can use that in the introspection tooling to basically say, okay, I don't care about missing schemas for this, so I'll just do exactly that. And that's significantly less work. Cool. All right. There's no removed APIs or actions, so that's an irrelevant one. The next question, this is something Sean Mooney brought up when I was chatting to them about doing this in Nova. Sean's idea was to actually publish the API schema via an API endpoint, similar to what Glance does for their schemas, as opposed to just statically building it and including it in like docs/source or like etc within the root of the repository. My gut on this is that we shouldn't do this, because I don't know how that interacts. We could consider this like separate to API microversioning, but we'll end up in a weird situation potentially where we make refinements to the schemas over time, we fix typos, or we make things a little bit stricter or something like that, to actually reflect how the server behaves and fix bugs in the schema as opposed to the other way around. And if you have deployed the Dalmation release with the first version of the open API schema, and then you pull that from the a Dalmation deployment, and then you go and pull it from the open API schema from an E deployment, you're going to get mismatches for about for the description of how an API behaves on a given microversion. I think it might be better to just say go directly to the source, the docs each time. But I'm not strict on this. Like if we want to publish this under like /schema within the API, and you go to the Cinder port or whatever /schema, and you get a JSON document back. If that's how we want to serve this to our users, that's a-okay, and it's easy enough to do. I just wanted to see what you folks thought.
I don't know that people really used, so for the glance schema endpoints, I mean, the idea was that people were going to be auto-generating clients and all this stuff. And what I found was that nobody seemed to know about them or care.
Yeah, like the JSON home stuff in Keystone, I only learned about that because I used curl and I got something back that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, so I'm kind of with my guts in line with yours. I think let's not do that. And then maybe at some point after it stabilizes, we could do it if there's demand. But I think let's not mess with that now.
Excellent. Okay, sounds good to me.
Yeah. I would also not vouch for a new API because like this adds another operation to the operator or the end user to generate it again and again to be up to date. Whereas with the statically generation, we are like delegating it to the project to keep it up to date. So they don't have to do the efforts unless there is a specific case where this API is required. I would say just generate it statically.
Yeah, like I said, I've made a point there about Nova and Cinder. So I'll be chatting to Nova on Thursday or Friday. So I'll take these into. I'll say the same thing. This is what the Cinder team were thinking, and I imagine they'll probably agree, but we'll see. And then there's an additional point there around paste. I don't know if you folks have had any discussions around the web framework. It's quite lucky for me that you use the exact same web frameworks as Nova. So basically the strategy I've arrived upon for Nova, I've effectively copied and pasted it in my proof of concept stuff in Cinder. But you folks aren't planning on moving away from WebApp or paste or anything in the Dalmation cycle, I assume. There isn't any big upheaval that I need to be warned about.
I don't think so.
Spot on. Okay, that's all I had. I have a spec up there. Please dump questions if it's still not clear. Hopefully I've cleared it up a small bit. I'll do my best to clean up the kind of proof of concept code I have and like push it up so you can at least see what a response validation looks like and the kind of work that I'm trying to do on the decorators. This shouldn't be hard to review, I'm hoping. And if there is anything that is particularly egregious that I've done in even the proof of concept patches, please let me know and I'll rejig it to make it as easy as possible. And yeah, give me a shout if there's anything that's confusing or anything else about it. That's all I had. Unless anyone has any other questions, I'm going to drop and jump into the ironic boom to talk about the exact same thing.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate your time.
Spot on. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey, Pete, it occurred to me, I was just looking at the existing agenda, and Christian, I believe, is unable to attend the majority of these sessions this week, but he does have his second topic there is related to Cinder backup improvements, and I believe it's possible that some of your work items are overlapping. That might be something you could drive, or at least provide some valuable context on. Take a look at those bullets and see what you think.
I did. It looks fine, and I continuously review what he posts, and it looks okay in general. But I see no issues. There was one place where I kind of disagreed with what he's done, but I'm not sure who's right. So I need to like set up some experiments. It was the like. Anyway, some of them are ready, and they just need to go in. Like I think the backup improvement, startup improvement time is one. That one required some changes to how we interface with SQL Alchemy, and Gork provided valuable insight on that, and I just implemented what he said essentially. It was easy enough. Other than that, let's see.
I see one about backups database table not having indexes. And Rajat, didn't we do something about that? Or did we forget about the backup ones? I know for volumes and other resources, we had a patch adding them as part of the quota stuff.
I think I had offered to help work on this, but I haven't actually spent time on it. They are missing the indexes.
Yeah, it wasn't for backups. I think it's for volume. I'm unable to remember the fields, but I think it was specifically for the volume table.
Okay, I'm adding this one to my items because I completely ignored that one. I thought, well, DB indexes, that's I'll poke Rajat sometime. I'm like, too much stuff to do. And I left it alone. So I'll find the time to look at it.
Well, let's sync up on that later because it's on my list right now too.
Okay, cool.
Well, I'm seeing a patch that merged that it's literally saying Cinder resource tables, volumes snapshot, backups, groups snapshot don't have required indexes to do efficient resource. So unless I forgot to add specifically the backup one, we should have it.
Can you list the...
Okay, so the thing is about this is that it's not strategic. We don't have to strategize about this. Like the only thing I want to know, what are the downsides? How more costly it is to update database if it does have an index rather than does not?
For something like
some price, right?
It's negligible as long as we don't just do it wrong.
Okay. All right, thanks.
It is there. I don't know if I missed the index that they want, but there are for deleted for project.
Yeah, he might be behind on the revision that he's testing there or something like that. Just needs a clarification. I'll do it when I get around to it, or maybe Eric said that it's on.
Or the index that's there maybe doesn't satisfy the actual need for. What was this for? Was DB purge the operation? The bug report doesn't say what release he was looking at.
Yeah. So I think maybe we do have now the indexes.
Do we have the right indexes?
Well, according to the report, the beginning of the report, we do have the right ones because the complaint was basically what I already detected. You have a lot of deleted stuff and it's affecting your performance. Soft deleted resources, I mean, and they make everything go slower. And that's why it mentions the purge. It's like, yeah, if I clean things up, it goes faster. But if we have indexes, it doesn't depend on you running the purge. It will be faster anyway. So for common requests, like a select by project ID, the new index covers that one, which is one of the common cases, because just a single backup list, if you had a lot of resources, backups, deleted or not, it would take forever, even constraining it to a specific project. So that one should be fixed. And the second query, the second explain, should also be fixed, which is based on a project non-deleted, that's also indexed correctly now. Anyway, like Pete said, no need to discuss this. This is simple. It is, did I mess it up and it's not done correctly, or is it already done? Not much discussion to be there. Just wanted to point out that whoever reviews it, or whenever I review it, this needs to be checked. The other patch.
Right. I'm trying to find the one that I like really concerned me was the in RBD backup specifically. There was something about like us we did a bug fix and that started accumulating snapshots and endlessly, and eventually you have like millions of them. And Christian posted a patch to do that, and then it was so hard to understand. I couldn't figure it out. I'm sorry, guys. I'm like,
Well, that was about actually changing the backups, right?
it's here somewhere. I saw it a second ago, but I can't find it now. Oh, there it is. So what can I say? I guess I need to just to do one last effort to review it and understand how that actually works, and then like plus twos. All the rest of the Christian's patches are just work items for me. Just do it. I don't see any particular like wrong thing to do, or they're all okay.
I wanted to add, I think I was talking to Brian a little bit earlier, and we were just an idea came up to use this week's festival reviews to focus on specifically on backup, the pending backup patches. That I posted a couple of links that give you sort of a dashboard. They've been kind of accumulating. It might be worth putting some effort into that this week. If anyone has any objections or is exceptionally in support of such a thing, let me know.
So regarding the bug report, I think it seems to be an old one because I just checked the indexes on the backup table and it shows the deleted and project ID as Gorka mentioned. So they are there. Not sure why I was under the assumption that we missed it, but yeah, they seem to be there.
Oh yeah, thanks. All right, John, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. Does anyone have anything else to add on this topic as it relates to Cinder backup improvements?
I am working on adding encryption to chunk driver right now. If this is not reflected on Etherpad, I think I should like put it somewhere. For some reason, but yeah, Christian, I guess, doesn't care about it. But I'll add it here anyway.
Somebody did though, because it's come up several times.
Yeah, it's properly accounted in Launchpad somewhere, and that's escaping me for a moment, but I'll add it. So just informing you people that this is on the agenda, and the initial, there is actually a spec for that, and looks fine. And but the interesting feature of the spec, and that it explicitly disclaims use of Barbition for this. Says for disaster recovery, we really need to reduce these dependencies, otherwise we cannot reboot the cluster from scratch. Which I thought was reasonable, and I did not object. But I thought it was asking for someone eventually, request that feature too. But that's going to be done separately. I don't think it's conflicting. Can be an enhancement after we produce the original. One thing I don't really like about this is that when amateurs like myself try to create encryption, they tend to make such a mess of this. Like, remember WEP encryption for 82.11? Or that's not the only case, it's just most famous one. And I'm really concerned that I will screw it up in such a way that will enable cryptanalysis of this very easily. And I will need some sort of special review for this. Not just for correctness in Cinder, but just, is there a screw up? And to begin with, I'm copying essentially the whole thing from Swift, where it's used as encryption at rest. Seems to be very isomorphic. It's essentially the same thing exactly, what we want in chunk driver. But I'm not sure if I'm right about that.
Well, what kind of,
yeah,
as far as worrying about vulnerabilities and review and everything, I mean, what kind of libraries and things are you using? Like, what level are you talking about writing code at as far as encryption stuff?
There is an encryption library that Swift uses, and we already use it, so I didn't even have to add any dependencies. Apparently, there is a driver that uses it. Speaking of Takashi's worries, he actually didn't even flag it in any of his reviews, but that's another thing where driver only uses it and it's in dependencies. And I'm like, okay, cool.
You using like AES directly or something?
Hold on a sec. Give me just a moment. Just a moment.
I think I vaguely remember seeing this driver a while back.
Oh, John is presenting. Okay, well, yeah, it's called cryptography. Just like literally, the library is called cryptography.
Pete, you can present. Feel free to drive.
Oh, it's gonna be recursive, but never mind. Yeah, there it is. I strongly suspect that no one will be able to read it. It's too small. Just
Your font size? I can. It's coming through fine here.
okay. So it's called cryptography, and it has some requirements. And this is the driver.
Well, we all agreed in retrospect that merging that driver that way was a mistake. And
Oh, I see.
We probably should not have allowed it to go in like that.
Well, okay, but I'm not okay. I'm not relying on the driver in any way, and I'm not copying any ideas how to encrypt from it. I'm just saying that when Takashi comes about or like move this to driver requirements.txt, I'll say that I use this module for my own purposes in essentially Cinder core. So yeah. So that's all there is to it. And if that driver is not good, then it's unfortunate. Oh, by the way, there is something. Oops, non-driver use.
Well, and I say that because the cryptography hazmat section that you see used in the driver there,
Yes.
it's like in the category of the you have to really know what you're doing with this from the cryptography
Yes.
library.
Yeah. But, yeah.
And
So my only excuse is that I'm stealing from Swift literally, and so far no one cracked that one. But maybe no one reported it. Cracked it in secret in some government lab or something.
It sounds reasonable to copy what Swift has and just say it in the commit message, in the code, whether like this is taken from there.
Okay. All right then. I'll just proceed with this, and we'll look at it when we are. When it's ready, but I'm going to roll it in like gradually, like minimally viable thing, and then like just in case I die tomorrow, then something remains in Garrett, and you can use it hopefully. That's about it for that. Okay. All right. So if no one has anything else, I think John can continue drive meeting forward. Also, I made a note about Marek's ideas, and just keep an eye on it.
Well, I think it's worth touching on the last piece in that section from Christian about the well, I'm interested in the MyPy stuff there. Some people have started talking about that as something we should do again. What's the general thought there? Like, are we?
I don't think it's backup related. Just MyPy is generally is great. Like, remember there was this regression that I did in restore to sparse, which MyPy was the only thing that could actually catch, because it was right on the level between API levels. Sorry, we have a one level unit tests and they all mock it on the underneath. Everything is fine. On the other one, exactly the same thing, but they do not match. And MyPy would have caught it. Just the number of arguments of one function was different. So yeah. I'm big enthusiast of that.
Well, and I of course am too. I mentioned it because there was a patch linked here that we should look at again at some point. But you know, the MyPy stuff, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to add it to Cinder, and I kind of just slowed down on it because the restriction was really just around how much people were willing to review it. So I'm wondering, with this discussion starting up again recently, is this going to be an area of interest in the near future, or kind of the same as before, or what?
Yeah, I'll review it. And MyPy is evolving to get better. And I noticed this because there was this type that was somehow kind of duck typed and it was kind of complex and in backup, where we, instead of explaining which type it actually is, we had to explain that, oh, it's just a pointer. And that kind of defeats the purpose of MyPy, and it makes it hard to tell which is covered and which is not. But it was very promiscuous type definition. And it turned out that it was almost a year ago, like I guess, MyPy was rolling out a special, yet another special workaround for this and for this type of typing. So we need to revisit this periodically, see what's up and how much better it is now, and then update requirements so the new MyPy is involved.
Well, we don't have to, because we now run with the newest release every time, so we don't have to check the requirements. What I was getting at is, should I actually start submitting patches around this again?
I'd love to do it, to see it. I just don't know like how much effort it takes for you to formulate it, and of course that would be frustrating if you do it and then no one cares.
Well, it takes time, and most of it is not particularly hard until we get into solving some of the, you know, what to do with Oslo and stuff like that. It's going to take some real work. But I don't know. Does anyone have any particular thoughts on this?
Well, the thing is, like, I'm pretty sure everyone would love to see it. They just like say, "Hey, Eric, do it," and then we'll review.
The problem is that then we don't review it, because Eric did a lot of work in this, and we dragged our feet into reviewing it, and that's why he really wants to know, if he makes the effort again, will we actually review it or not?
Well, but you know, you cannot ask people this. People will say, "Okay, I'll make sure," and then
But
things
then
happen.
he will write down your name and follow you to the end of the
Oh, yeah.
earth for you to do the review.
Oh, I'm okay with that. I really like the MyPy, and if he reminds me about it, and I just look through all incoming patches in my mailbox. But if he specifically reminds me, that's welcome. I'm okay with that.
So the last time how we were able to merge those patches was conduct a festival of MyPy reviews and then assign cores to each of the patches, like 2 cores to each patch. And then, I mean, it was a forceful attempt, but yeah, I did get the work done. Because it was delayed for like 3 releases, so we had to eventually do it.
Right.
we could do this again. We could use one of our festival review slots for something like that.
I think it would be a better use of time to have a festival of people making MyPy changes instead of just reviewing them, because it's really not that hard to do. You just have to actually sit there and do it.
Well, but I feel like as soon as I tried to do it, things went sideways. Mm. No, I think that's asking for too much. At least for me. You need someone who has time management skills, can do the normal work and then MyPy.
What's this type guard thing? I guess I should look it up in the docs.
It's a special like Python typing thing that lets you like specify that a method or a call is narrow to type, I think. I haven't actually dug into using the type guard stuff myself. Yeah, I think what it does is it'll let you annotate a method so that when you call it and get a return from it, it also kind of returns information to the type check system. I would assume that if you're structuring your code correctly, which of course is hard to say that we're doing since we wrote it all before type checking. But I would assume that if you have your code structured well, this would be kind of a rare thing to use.
Okay.
I don't remember what Pete was using it for in his patch. It's been a while since I looked at it. But it actually, I think it showed up in that patch because it didn't work on 3.8, which I think we still are running jobs with currently, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, so that specific patch can be postponed until we rotate deep enough so the type guard is available. But any others, yeah, but please do. You already mentioned some low-hanging fruit.
Well, I also haven't, I didn't
So
ever review.
Dalmation does not support 3.8.
Yeah, but I think we have functional jobs right now that still run it, if I remember correctly. Because I tried, I have a patch somewhere that will only work on like 3.9 plus, and it, I think, doesn't pass yet.
We may not have updated our Zool config.
Because I think we removed the 3.8 unit test job, but I think it's still running in some functional jobs or something. I was going to say too, I didn't actually review that patch from Pete in depth enough to know if you actually have to use type guard or if there's a different way to do it. Or
Oh yeah. I kind of boycott Stack Overflow, but I admit that this was somebody else's idea.
Yeah, I'd just never seen it before. That's what I was asking.
So for the unit test, I think there is a template in the Zool project, Zool config, that we use. I'm not sure about the functional tests. Do we update them manually or?
I think
So
those
you
we
need
have to update manually. Yeah, so we should take a maybe I'll take an action item to review our Azul.config and report back tomorrow. Because we'll probably have to change it in all our projects. At least with Cinderlib retired, we don't have to worry about that one because that was always slightly off by half a cycle, and man, it drove you crazy.
In Cinder, we have 3.9 and 3.10 running for functional.
Yeah, I have a patch that removed the from __ future import annotations, and it failed last year on some jobs, but I can try to rebase it and see where it is now.
So we're about 20 afternoon. I think we might be able to squeeze in this other Christian topic today with the remaining time. Specifically, this is a query that Christian raised a few months ago about the auth capabilities between Glance and Cinder, and a discrepancy between what's required versus what's documented for a deployer. And there's a, I was just looking at it, it's pretty significant mailing list thread. Rajat, you actually participated and engaged in that discussion with him. I wonder if, I haven't had a chance to read the entire thread. I'm not sure if it reaches a conclusion or not. Do you remember where this stands?
I haven't followed the recent updates, but what Christian wanted to do was define correct profiles for RBD for different projects, like for Glance, Cinder, Nova, how they use it, and for the pools, they wanted the right access for them. And for the access, now I think we use profiles. Yeah, I did reply to the mail, but again, I don't have any expertise on the deployment side of things. So my suggestions were also countered by Christian at some places. But I think main thing was for the Cinder project, we wanted DevStack to be configured in a way that we use the right profiles as a deployment should use. So it acts as a reference and also documented somewhere in the Cinder project, like what we recommend for Ceph RBD deployments to have the profiles for those pools, the volume or the backups. So that was his ask. I haven't followed the recent updates on the thread, so maybe there was a conclusion, but at that point, I don't think there was anything. Also, just a history on this is because it came up because Glance had to access the Cinder pool, so it needed read access. I think it was for some effort related to like RBD. I mean, when we create a volume, bootable volume, we, in case of RBD, we do a cow clone, and if the Glance image needs to be deleted, it should first check if it has any dependencies or not. So for that, like Glance needed the dependency of read on the Cinder volume spool, and that I think wasn't working for some deployments because they didn't configure it in that way, and the operation was failing for them. And Yeah, so they wanted a consistent way. Like they didn't find any docs to like mention this change that we have. It was mentioned in the release notes, but again, no OpenStack documentation for this. So
The error is coming from Glance, though. I assume he's receiving that error from a call to the Glance API. Should this then be, this documentation should be on the deployment of Glance, or
so that was the first occurrence of the issue. But again, they wanted, like, if sender introduces a change in the future that might require a read or write dependency on like VM's pool or some other pool, then we need to document it. So we just wanted like these cases to be avoided. So this was a particular case of Glance, but even for Cinder or Nova, if they have the right profile set in RBD, like what they wanted to deploy, and a deployment tool like DevStack should also reflect the same thing, like if they could reference from there. So I think that they want it. So either if they're even using a different deployment tool, they can just reference RBD and use the same profiles as that for their deployment. So they just want a working deployment and the right configurations of RBD for it.
so ultimately, does this fall on us to, like, do we, what's the actionable thing here? Do we, is our documentation short in some way? Does this fall in the jurisdiction of like the deployment tools, or?
Well, somebody is going to just need to go through how we use Ceph between Cinder and Glance and Nova and wherever, and try this out and document how to configure it in kind of the most locked down way, permissions wise, that actually works. I would not find it unlikely for that to end up being driven from the Cinder side. But I mean, this was talked about a while ago when Christian first raised it, and it just hasn't happened yet because nobody's wanted to go spend the time to do it. But it's a very reasonable request. I think we had also theorized last time we talked about this that it would make sense to have the DevStack Ceph plugin be able to deploy it this way too.
Looking at the thread, there hasn't been any update on it. And I did suggest some permissions, like the read, write, execute permissions for the volumes and backups pool. But it didn't have any integration level thing on the Glance Sender side. And even like they didn't want exact permission, they wanted profiles. So the permissions could be set for OSD monitors. They wanted profiles that are set across like all the Ceph components, like the monitor and OSDs combined. So that was their ask. Also, I got to know like Cinder requires read access in the VM's pool. There is a strange explanation to that in the thread, the last part. But yeah,
Most of that, when services require access to the other pools, comes down to the fact that we do copies or we do clones with copy on write stuff between them, right?
I mean, Eugene said that, so for the VMs and volumes pool, like why they require the read access is like they are using Cinder client or something. And I don't know like how, I don't fully understand that explanation, but
Because Nova is using the Cinder RBD credentials. Is that what you mean by that?
yeah, that might be the case because it mentions for ephemeral case, like when they are creating ephemeral disk in RBD, then yeah, maybe what you said, like Cinder credentials for accessing the RBD cluster.
Yeah, I don't really know why that would be happening off the top of my head, but
We've got 30 minutes left. Maybe we can squeeze in Merrick's topic, the final one for today. If we feel like we're ready to move on from the auth, the Ceph auth. Merrick, are you around? Are you? I see you on. But are you
Yes.
able to present on the topic?
Present. Well, now I should start with saying that now that when I understand the goal and structure of this meeting, I start to have doubts if this point fits the meeting at all. But well, let's try. I have a specific use case, and I'm interested in open discussion, how it can be solved. So if this is fine for you, I can present it. Okay, excellent. So the use case is this. For as of today, Cinder has one backend set. This is Swift. There is a lot of data already stored in Swift, and I would like to migrate somehow to S3 backend for backups without interfering in any way users. So it should be without downtimes, without asking or forcing users to move data or to start new backups. And yeah, everything from a specific date should be written to S3, but old data should be accessible. One thing that maybe make this easier is that both Swift and S3 are based on Junked driver, and I don't consider any other backend.
How similar is this to the notion of the backup service supporting multiple backends, which is a topic that's been kicked around for many cycles? similar to the volume drivers.
Well, but there is no actual migration. You add a new backend, that's good. New backups go there, but the old backups are still in the old backend. So,
But what are you going to do with them if you can't access it from the backup service?
So do you want to actually migrate the old backups, or you just want them to be accessible?
I want them to be accessible. I think it won't be feasible to migrate them. I don't want to deal with catching up with migrating data and dealing with data deltas and stuff like that. So it's fine to leave existing data on Swift and just have it readable. And I assume that at some point of time, and I don't have constraints here, it might be a year or two, they will just expire.
well, in that case, I think Alan is right. Your objective is isomorphic or equivalent to having several backends, which we were like bending around for a while, and I kind of signed up to do it, except I didn't do anything for a year. If you could just do it, then I would very much welcome it. That would be a big help.
I saw
the topic was.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Just as you mentioned, I remember seeing lots of work in the past where people had started on this, and the idea was to run the backup through the scheduler.
But I would like to ask one thing. The topic is migrate Cinder backups. So it is not only having multiple access to the old and the new, it's also that data wants to be moved, as I'm reading it, right?
No, data does not have to be moved.
Yeah, I think Mark just chose the word migrate. I think he just means conceptually. I want to migrate in the conceptual sense from storing my backups in Swift. Now I'd like to store them in S3, but I want to be able to get at the old Swift backups.
All right. So yeah, second backend and the one it exists, but does not accept writes. Okay.
Yeah, because we don't support multiple backends. That's why I wanted to migrate, I think.
Right.
So yeah, this sounds like it should be handled as multiple backends, like Alan says, which is basically handled at the scheduler. And basically, it's reproducing what we do for Cinder volumes. When you want to create one, you have a volume type. In this case, it would be a backup type. And then based on that, you create the location. For your use case, where you have a new backend and you don't want to write anything to the old one, you would only provide one backup type that it's not accessible or whatever for the old one, and everybody would use the new one. It would have to be, or it may need to be even more complex, and you would need to have, like we do in Cinder Volume, where you can disable backends or things like that, which means that they no longer accept writes. What was the approach, the POC that you were working on, by the way, to see how your work fits?
My POC, well, that is kind of dirty. I created a proxy driver that instantiates two drivers, Swift and S3, and it tries to access data on S3. If it fails, then it falls back to Swift. Otherwise, it throws exception. And I can read every backup object has information which driver was used to write it, to store it. So retrieving this data, I can just pick the right instance of the driver. It's not pretty, and it assumes that both drivers inherit from chunked driver because I rely on this logic, but the prototype works.
Yeah, I find that one maybe hard to merge upstream, to be honest. Because, yeah, I understand it works. It is a quick and nice, I mean, nice in the right way, in the good way solution. If I had to do it, maybe that's how I would have done it. But from an upstream perspective, and as a project with some commitment to abstraction, to this, to that, probably the multiple backends is the right approach. And I don't know, to be honest, how much work that would be. Because it may not be a lot if you limit the scope. Because in the past, the scope got too big. It was not only to have multiple backends going through a scheduler, it was also possible to use, this was back when Ivan was working on this, to use any Cinder volume driver to do backups and blah, blah. So the scope was very large. But if we limit this to just being able to run multiple backup services with different drivers and be able to schedule it via the scheduler, maybe it is not that huge.
I saw the blueprint of this, and I have to admit it was intimidating for me. I'm definitely not familiar enough with Cinder code to try to implement this. But if we limit the scope,
oh, you mean the one
original?
That I said was too large? Yeah.
Yes. But if I limit the scope, maybe it will be doable. So what is the next step? To present you a spec, maybe for a review?
Yeah, it would be a spec saying what you want, well, the problem you want to solve, how you think it can be solved, and then if you think that there are alternatives, you mention alternatives. For example, you could mention this alternative you tried and say why the other is preferred. And from there, we would review it and yeah.
Yeah, I think if you focused on the use cases, but perhaps also listed the negative use cases, the non-use cases. That way we know these are the problems you're attempting to solve, and to avoid feature creep, we're not going to cover these use cases. For example, migrating the actual data. You don't want to do that now.
I have added a link for Kurka was mentioning about the spec template. So we do have a example template which mentions all the sections that we need to fill out and what information needs to go there. Online, it's not visible.
307?
Yeah, right. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, and since it looks like we're kind of light with topics, you don't have to write the spec, in 2 days, but you could sort of sketch it out and come back and, talk about some of the stuff if you want.
Okay, I will see what I can do.
You think I am unable to find the old one at all that Marek found intimidating. I have this document. It exists, and to do item is to find the spec that it's somewhere. Like, we can.
I think intimidating one might be this one. The grand unified theory of backups.
Holy cow.
But I linked in the Etherpad what I think is a little bit more streamlined than the generic backup, which would use the volume drivers and all the fancy stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. Okay. What line is it, Alan?
Well, the generic one I put in the meeting chat.
Yes, I already have.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm at the level that the spec at line 304 was intimidating, not the grand idea of backups.
Okay. Oh, thanks. Oh, that's very helpful.
I might be able to find this link after the meeting, but believe it or not, I think somebody actually has a WIP patch up many years ago, but
I
there actually
found,
may be a starting point.
I found this other spec which mentions about multiple backup backends.
Where is that?
Yeah, I think that's the one that I linked in on line 304.
Yep.
Oh, I didn't
But
see
yeah,
that.
it is, if you want to feel less intimidated, because yeah, this spec start talking about having multiple configuration sections, a bunch of stuff that is harder to wrap your head around. You can start with something simple for your POC, a POC of, oh, I can schedule. It's use different Cinder configuration files to start different services. So you launch Cinder backup with the configuration in the default section like it does today. And then you launch it again with a different configuration file, which contains a different configuration. That way, you can focus on the scheduler part, which is, let's say, the interesting thing to discuss. Because in the other part, the how do I read this from files, the different sections, it probably is a lot easier. It's just copy paste bunch of stuff from how Cinder Volume does it, and probably we can help you with that because it's just tedious work. It's not engineering work, not high level thought. Is how do I do this with Cinder in Cinder? You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah.
In the review, what most people will want to read about is the details of the scheduling, and that sort of thing. The other is there will be sections, and we
Can
can
we
help
just,
you with that, I think.
not schedule for now?
Sorry?
Can we just not schedule for now and then implement it in
I
such a way
think
that
right now we go by the scheduler.
like
I believe
write a
we are
configuration that
currently
says like
already.
the primary is this one, that's where all the writes go, and you have additional ones. Scheduler sounds a little
But the scheduler
involved.
is this initial scheduler could be as simple as in the basic scheduling, something like we have now, based on the name you give me. It doesn't have to do anything fancy, as in, oh, detect the amount of space available, do the, yeah, just based on the
That's what I was
name, I go, oh, yeah, but by a scheduler, I mean, it has to go there. And we can start with, it doesn't do dynamic scheduling, it doesn't do anything fancy. Just if the backup type either has a name or doesn't have a name. Doesn't have a name, it goes to a random one. Has a name, it goes there.
No, I
And
got your point, yes.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
but does it have to be like where it's going to reside? Is it inside backup service or is it in a... So basically, is there RPC involved or not?
Well, the RPC, I believe we already have it. If I'm not mistaken, backup services already report to a scheduler.
Yes.
The scheduler already has a create backup method. So all it would need to do is say, oh, I'm receiving data from different backends. So I have to separate them as two different entities. And then when a create comes in, it decides based on the backup type, which of the two needs to go. I would say that is the minimal implementation. It's not feature rich. It does not. It is not at the equivalent of what we have in volumes, but it could be an initial approach that could be as part of the incremental process of fully supporting multiple backups.
Found it. This may be too complicated and I don't know where to put it, but let me try this.
Paste.
Sorry.
There we go. Okay, got it. That was Ivan's early work.
Oh, brother.
Abandoned. This is why I didn't find it. Okay.
Oh, so we are not sending. Oh, but this probably is trying, like you say, doing the fancy stuff of sending capabilities and all that, probably.
Yeah, that I don't know. Just purely based on the, well, maybe.
But this is a good starting point, definitely.
Yeah, it shows me places to touch.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
my case, the scheduling part, in my case, the limited scope is very easy. All creates goes to one type of backend. I mean, one backend. All creates goes there.
Mm-hmm.
And restore, yeah, that depends.
Yeah, but the scheduler seems to, a lot of stuff seems to be already here, coded in this one. They create, restore. It is in Cinder scheduler manager. So I think this is a very good, thank you, Alan, because I think this is the best example to look at.
Yeah, even the capacity filter might work. Don't store anything else. Don't store more backups on Swift. You're out of room.
I have one question to make sure that this is the right approach. Will this approach handle incremental backups? As in, there is a full backup and incremental backup already on Swift, and I want to do another incremental backup, and it should go to S3. Now, for incremental backup, we need to read metadata or the shy list from parent backup, and this is on different backend.
Mm-hmm. So let me see if it's already implemented. You can do it in the scheduler. You would be able to do it, and the thing is that I don't know if here it is implemented. Let me see. Because in that case, when you're doing an incremental, you really don't need to, the scheduling is not scheduling. It is just maybe confirming that there is room or things like that, because you already know what the backend needs to be.
Yes, but it will be the S3, I mean the Cinder backup configured with S3. And this process will try to read parent backup that is stored on Swift. And I don't have a Swift driver in this process.
No, but what I mean is when you do an incremental, it would be if you do an incremental and you say incremental of this backup, and I also provide a volume and backup type, and they do not match, it should be rejected. I cannot do an incremental of backup in Swift, of a backup that it's in Swift into the other backend. That makes no sense. It's like trying to do a snapshot of a volume in a different backend. It's like, doesn't compute. So the API should reject it as in not possible. I cannot do an incremental of that because you cannot do it. You can do a full backup, but not incremental, right? Or
yeah, that may be the limitation you'll be faced with, Marek, is that if you really want to keep doing incrementals, you're going to have to start with a full backup on the new backend.
Yeah, this is limitation I was hoping to avoid.
But
that is not the transparent anymore.
But that could be a feature that with a flag you could say, if you're doing an incremental and the backend is disabled, blah, 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 do a full in a new one. For example, RBD in backups normally. If you ask for incremental and it cannot do an incremental, it does a full backup. Is if I cannot do what you ask me, I do full. So this could be that we in the spec, we could try to work out if there could be a flag to allow this, to allow change into a different one. That would need to be spelled out because that would not be the normal usage.
But then user will be built for full backup and not incremental.
But it is a full backup because it doesn't exist on the new backend, right?
I mean, the full backup was in the old backend, and now a user, instead of creating incremental backup, which may cost very little because the delta may be very small, now will be forced to do the full backup. And it's built for, say, 2 terabytes instead of 200 megabytes.
So I think that feature that you want would be a follow-up feature, which is to be able to have an incremental in a different location if it's based on the chunk backup driver, so that the restore can be done in 2 parts. First, you ask one of the drivers to do the restore, then you ask the second to do its part. That would be a follow-up feature because that's not a feature that exists today, which is to restore from 2 different drivers. That is a new feature because the backup without a restore is nothing. So that would be a completely different feature. And for that feature to make sense, you need to support 2 different backends. So it's a precondition to have support for 2 backends before you want to say, now I want to a nice feature where I can start creating backups in a new location and be incremental from the old location so that I don't force a new full backup. So the feature you're asking for, now that you explain it, makes sense, but it's a follow-up feature. Because we try to split the features into chunks that make sense in that they cover a use case and not cover everything in the same one.
Okay.
And that's why I understand your POC with a proxy.
It covers all the requirements.
Your use case is fully covered, but it's, yeah.
I know. I understand.
So if you want the feature upstream, you would need to have it probably to follow something close to what we're saying. If you don't want it, I believe you can create your own custom driver, have your PyPy package that it's proxy Cinder backup, and use that by defining it in your configuration, the driver location as the one that you install with your package.
Yes. Let me put all the pieces together in my head, think this through, and get more familiar with the code, most of all. And yeah, and let's see. I'll try to present the spec. So from my side, this is done. Thank you, and I really appreciate your time and inputs.
Yeah, and you can ask on IRC if you have questions like, I cannot find this, or does this make sense? And if we are around, we can probably help you navigate the exploring of the code and everything.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
So just to summarize, like the minimum implementation we can do is create backup types, tie them to a particular backend, and then use them to create backups. And the scheduler will just check in the backup type if it's associated to any backend. And if it is not, then randomize the available backends to create the backup. That should be the minimum.
That sounds good to me. And by create, it's create, delete. So all the features should work and restore based on the backup type.
Yeah.
I think that would be the minimum, and that creates a good basis for improvements. Like somebody wants, now I want to support capabilities like the backup can report how much space it has left. So we add that. Now we want to be able to migrate from one backup to another backend. That could be a new feature. The feature that we were talking about, being able to do the backup in a different location and then restore from both of them, that would be worked on this basis, I think.
Yeah, almost a roadmap of, you know, extensions to the basic capability.
So we might require different sections because we cannot differentiate between the options. Like if everything goes into the default section, like which points to Swift, which points to S3.
You start with different configuration files. So that's why I put it in question marks, because you may just, it is easier for development if you say, it is your problem how you, from an installer perspective, how you do it. Each backup service looks at the default. There is no multiple ones, and you can start them. I will start my first backup for Swift with a cinder-swift.conf, and the other one with cinder-s3.conf. So you just use different configuration files for the different services.
So when you say different configuration files, like this, all this information goes into cinder.conf, like which?
No, you have etc cinder.conf, but that's just one way to deploy Cinder. You have many options. You can use a different location. Etc cinder-swift.conf. That could be another one. And your systemd or whatever, however you want to start your service in a container, systemd, whatever you want, you provide in the cinder-backup space, config, this location to use a different config file. You know what I mean? And you can even provide multiple configuration files so that you have a basic cinder.conf and then an overlay with a different file that only changes the backup driver and the backup specific configuration in the default section, and the database and everything else comes from the normal cinder.conf file. So Oslo config allows a lot of playing around. And one of the things is overlays in Cinder in configuration files, where they are read in order, and each one gets an overlay on top of the other. So the idea here would be, you manage your configuration, I don't care, do whatever you want, but each of them will always read in the default section, the backup.
Is it like drop-in directories, like cinder.con.d, and then okay,
that is one way of doing it, where you can have But the difference with system cinder.conf.d is that by default, Oslo config reads all the files in there. Whereas if you provide a single file or two files, because you can provide multiple, then Oslo config will limit to those and not go to cinder.conf.d and read everything. So
Yeah, it presents the merge of the file specified as basically a single config object. It overlays them for you, so you don't have to deal with it at all. You just get what appears to be one complete config file, which may or may not be made up of multiples.
but the important part is that you can specify your config file. It doesn't have to be cinder.conf. You can change it when you call the service. So that would be the trick. If we say, oh, for simplicity, the first implementation, let's not add Cinder, enable backup backends with different sections. That could be I'm just saying in case that is an option. I'm not saying that I am saying all into doing it that way. I'm saying that maybe if we are very interested in this feature, we could consider it that way. For example, for Red Hat Next deployment tool that is going to be in containers, in OpenShift, blah, 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 this works for us. If all the different backup are defined in the default section, we don't care. It works for us because we are going to create a specific configuration files for each of the backends. So it will work fine. Each of them, of the backends, will have its own configuration file independent. So that's why I'm not so opposed. Alan?
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. I hope we're not heading to a situation where when the cloud admin wants to reconfigure their backup service, we have to change how the Cinder service is executed because you have to change the command line options for which config file to read. That sounds kind of messy.
No, it's if you have two backends, let's say I am deploying things manually and there to explain it, but it would be a tool. For each of the backup services that the backends that I want to use in backup, a specific systemd will be created. And in the systemd command to execute, it will direct to a specific cinder.conf file. I'm talking generic, not our deployment tool at Red Hat. It will say cinder-swift-backup.conf for the specific Swift systemd unit. And because you have configured I want multiple backups, I will create another systemd unit that will use a different config file. And I don't need to change it. It will always be the same, but it will be different for each backend. So not all the Cinder backups will use the same configuration file.
So for each backup service that you want associated with a different backend, they'd be started with, run the Cinder backup with, -- config file Swift backup.conf versus S3 backup.conf.
Yes. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying that maybe in the spec it can be discussed properly. And that, for example, I'm not worried if that is something that the community decides. Basically, I'm not going to -2 the approach if the community is okay with it. Because Red Hat tool, the Red Hat installer will not have a problem with that. That's what I'm saying. It's like, I'm not going to veto if that is proposed and that is accepted. Just food for thought in the spec.
We can evaluate both the choices, like if it's not a big effort for the different backup sections and versus this one. So I think Marik can do a like high level analysis of development efforts of both cases.
Yeah, and maybe even we can throw in a follow-up patch ourselves with on Marek code as a follow-up. This is how you would do the configuration stuff, because we are more familiar and that's probably easy for us. It's like, oh, in the command dash backup, I know I just have to copy the cinder section and do this, or, you know, we may be more familiar with how we do that. To be honest, I'm trying to lower the difficulty for this feature to get in, because I think it is a nice feature and everything else we can improve afterwards. And I think it's been long overdue to have this feature. That's why I keep thinking of ways to make it easier to get it in. But anyway, we can discuss it in the spec, and we can help you, Marek, understand where to look. And if you're looking at that specific patch and you don't understand why something is being done, you can ask us, because I think there will be things that are not fully baked in that patch, and you will maybe think, this doesn't look right. Oh, but the author was a core, so maybe I'm missing something. Just ask us and we will have a look, in case your thought process is correct and the patch is not complete.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
I have mentioned the IRC channel as well. You can ask your queries there, and depending on the time zone, someone will reply.
We are at the end of our time and at the end of our list. So, unless anyone has anything to add, we'll reconvene tomorrow. We'll start with the team photo. We'll revisit the docstring improvements and see where the wind takes us.
So for tomorrow, like, what should be the time? Because like, so we need some time to discuss revisit the topic of documentation and then team photo. After that, we have a cross project. So maybe, I don't know. I mean, meeting at 1300 would be like, we would have too much time. Maybe we can meet a little later. I don't know. I mean, just suggesting.
I'm wide open for the day. I mean, we can do nearly anything you want to do. I guess my only thought would be, what is the chance that a last minute topic gets added? It seems maybe low, but yeah, barring that, we can start later. What time would you propose?
No, you're right. Sorry, Brian, you were saying.
No, I was going to say 1400 seems good.
Yep, sounds good. 1 hour to discuss the doc stuff, which is mostly going to be assigning things, making sure that we haven't forgotten any methods. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, sounds good to me as well. And regarding last minute topics, there is a topic in the planning section. So it did get added for bring your own keys.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Just reminder to stop the recording, maybe. I always used to forget these things.
That sounds like lesson learned from your PTL time.
Yeah,
They